In the spring of 1223, a dark cloud of 20,000 Mongol horsemen materialized in the southern Russian steppes, reminiscent of a shadow gliding across boundless plains. For weeks on end, they advanced deep into adversarial territory. Russian commanders observing their movement found themselves utterly perplexed. There were no supply trains, no baggage, no visible food provisions, just men mounted on small horses, moving at a pace unprecedented for any army. The Rus-Cuman coalition assembled a formidable force of 80,000 warriors, quadrupling the Mongol numbers. Their host possessed everything a military was expected to have: wagons overflowing with grain and salted meats, herds of livestock for fresh provisions, skilled artisans for equipment repair, and a logistical network extending back to their cities. This was how civilized warfare operated. This was how an army was provisioned in the field. General Subutais' Mongol forces, however, lacked all such amenities. They would cover 60 and sometimes even 100 miles a day, traversing seemingly impassable terrain and operating under conditions that should have seen them succumb to starvation within a week. Russian commanders dispatched scouts to the Mongol encampments at night. The reports they returned with made no sense. The Mongols weren't unloading supplies. They merely drank from leather pouches. Then, at dawn, they would mount their horses and once again cover an incredible distance. "Where is their food?" a Russian prince reportedly asked his advisors. No one had an answer. The Russian commanders, indeed no one, truly grasped the implications until the Mongol Empire had conquered half the known world. The Mongols had stumbled upon something revolutionary. They transformed what everyone perceived as their greatest weakness into the most devastating military advantage in human history. The secret lay not in what they carried, but in what they rode. Once you comprehend this revelation, once you grasp the extent to which the Mongols completely rewrote the rules of warfare, your perception of military logistics will be forever altered. Let me elucidate why the Mongol army never required food provisions as they systematically conquered the globe. To understand why the Mongol system appeared impossible, one must first appreciate how every other army functioned in the 13th century. By the standards of that era, what the Mongols achieved was truly insane. European armies crawled along like snails, carrying their homes on their backs. A typical force of 10,000 men demanded hundreds of supply wagons, each drawn by oxen or horses that themselves required 20 pounds of grain daily. Grain for soldiers, grain for the animals pulling the grain, forage for cavalry mounts, spare wheels, blacksmiths, bakers, butchers. An army was more than just soldiers. It was a moving city of logistical personnel, often outnumbering the combatants themselves. This system adhered to strict, ironclad rules understood by all. You couldn't advance more than 15 or 20 miles a day because the supply train couldn't keep pace. You were confined to roads, as wagons couldn't traverse rugged terrain. Your route was predictable, as you needed to remain near towns where additional provisions could be requisitioned or purchased. And you were vulnerable, desperately vulnerable, because if enemy forces severed your supply lines, your army would disintegrate within days. The Chinese had developed even more sophisticated systems. Their armies during the Song dynasty perfected the art of military logistics. Organized depots, systematic resupply, rice deliveries coordinated over hundreds of miles. They could field immense armies and keep them fed through meticulous planning and infrastructure. It was impressive, intricate, and a hallmark of an advanced civilization. And it all rested on one fundamental assumption: an army marches on its stomach. This adage, often attributed to Napoleon 5 centuries later, reflected a truth universally acknowledged in the medieval world. Logistics equated to civilization. Supply lines equated to power. The more refined your supply system, the more potent your army. Then came the Mongols, nomadic pastoralists from the steppes north of China. They possessed no cities, no agriculture, no infrastructure. Their way of life appeared primitive to civilized observers. They dwelt in felt yurts that could be loaded onto carts. They migrated seasonally, following grazing lands for their herds. They drank fermented mare's milk and, according to horrifying visitor accounts, even the blood of their horses during lean times. When the first Mongol envoys appeared at the Chinese and Middle Eastern courts, The sophisticated diplomats of these empires saw precisely what they expected: barbarians. Formidable fighters, certainly. Dangerous raiders, undoubtedly, but fundamentally limited by their primitive lifestyle. They could strike swiftly and vanish back into the steppes, but lengthy campaigns were beyond their grasp. They lacked the capacity to lay siege to cities or project their power over vast distances. European military theorists, if they even bothered to analyze the Mongols, perceived these same limitations. The diminutive Mongol horses appeared weak when contrasted with the massive European war horses. The Mongols visibly lacked a supply infrastructure, seemingly subsisting on almost nothing. The consensus among all military experts from Paris to Baghdad was unequivocal. Mongols might be excellent raiders, but they lacked the logistical means for prolonged warfare. They would starve as soon as they left the steppe pastures. Their primitive way of life was considered a fundamental weakness that would forever restrict their military potential. This opinion persisted until the Mongols conquered the most extensive land empire in human history. Because, as it turned out, every military expert in the civilized world was catastrophically, startlingly wrong. This is what no one grasped. When the Mongols set out to conquer the world, there was only one limiting factor for their military operations: not food, nor water, nor supplies, but grass. I understand how absurd this sounds. Grass, that's the secret. But hear me out, because it completely changes everything. Consider what slowed down European and Chinese armies. It wasn't the soldiers. Soldiers can march 30 kilometers a day if necessary. What hampered these armies was feeding the horses. A war horse requires between 9 and 14 kilograms of grain daily. Not grass, but grain. Oats, barley, prepared fodder. This grain needed to be cultivated, harvested, stored, transported, and distributed. The entire cumbersome machinery of medieval logistics existed primarily to sustain the horses. Mongol horses were different, fundamentally biologically distinct. They were not the massive war horses of European knights or the prize steeds of Chinese cavalry. Mongol horses were small, perhaps around 14 hands high at the withers, sturdy, with thick coats. To civilized eyes, they looked like ponies, almost comically small. Yet these animals had evolved on the Central Asian steppes over millennia and possessed capabilities that made them the most effective military mounts in history. The Mongol horse could survive entirely on grass. Not special grass or cultivated fodder, but simply any grass it could find, including grass buried under snow, which it would dig up with its hooves. And these horses lived outdoors year-round, in temperatures ranging from -40 degrees Celsius in winter to 30 degrees Celsius in summer. They didn't need stables, they didn't need grain, and they didn't require human care at all. Do you understand what this implied? Do you comprehend how this altered everything? A European army needed to carry horse feed with them or stay near sources where it could be obtained. This created supply lines, a logistical tail, a predictable route. A Mongol army only needed the grass-covered steppe, and pastures covered approximately 1/5 of Earth's landmass, forming an almost continuous belt from Hungary to Korea. The Mongol Empire wasn't built on roads or supply depots, it was built on grass. It was literally an empire powered by solar energy. Grass grows from sunlight. Horses eat grass. Mongols ride horses. The entire war machine operated on photosynthesis. Compare this to later empires. The British Empire was powered by wind, relying on ships and trade winds. The American Empire runs on oil, on fossil fuels, extracted, refined, and distributed through complex infrastructure. The Mongols needed none of this. Their energy source grew ubiquitously in the wild, wherever they needed to go. But here's where it gets truly fascinating, because this system had a limitation that actually made the Mongols more dangerous, not less. The grazing area could sustain only a certain number of grazing animals. Even rich steppes would be depleted if 100,000 horses attempted to graze in one spot. This meant Mongol armies couldn't move as a single concentrated mass. They had to disperse, sometimes over hundreds of miles, splitting into separate columns that foraged independently. To European and Chinese commanders, this appeared as chaos. It seemed like a weakness that could be exploited. A divided army could be broken into pieces, destroyed sequentially. Except that the Mongols had organized their society around this particular problem for centuries. They had a system, and this system transformed a seeming weakness into their signature tactical advantage. Contemporaries repeatedly described this in accounts from Russia, China, Persia, and Hungary. They said the Mongols were everywhere at once. Not consecutively, not one after another, but everywhere simultaneously. Mongol columns, in vast numbers, conducted synchronized campaigns across distances that should have made any coordinated effort impossible, converging on targets from multiple directions simultaneously. The year 1241 saw Mongol forces engaging Hungarian and Polish armies in Eastern Europe, concurrently executing operations against Korea on the Asian continent's opposite side. A single military doctrine spanned 5,000 miles. The grasslands were the key enabler. The imperative to disperse for grazing had devastating tactical consequences, and the horses nourished by these grasses were central to everything else. Permit me to elaborate on the Mongol horses, for without comprehending these animals, one cannot truly grasp the functioning of the Mongol military machine. Mongol children learned to ride before they walked. This is neither hyperbole nor metaphor. By age 3, a child was fastened to a horse's saddle, secured to prevent falling, and the horse was led around the encampment. The child developed balance, attuned to the horse's rhythm, and recognized that being mounted was as natural as standing on solid ground. By age 5, the bindings were removed, and the child rode unassisted. By 5, they possessed their own bow. By adolescence, they could gallop for entire days without pause, sleep in the saddle, and display remarkable accuracy with a bow at full gallop. This was not military training, it was simply steppe childhood. Every Mongol from birth was a cavalryman, and the horses they rode were extraordinary creatures, serving far more purposes than mere transport. Each Mongol warrior on campaign typically maintained 4 to 6 horses. Some accounts suggest elite units had up to 18 horses per person, though this appears to be an exaggeration. The standard allowance was likely 5 or 6, predominantly mares with a few geldings. The warrior would rotate horses throughout the day, riding one while the others followed unburdened, switching every few hours to keep their mounts fresh. This method allowed them to cover those improbable distances. 60 miles a day was not uncommon. 100 miles was achievable in emergencies. European knights, encumbered by heavy armor and riding grain-fed war horses, might cover 20 miles. Mongol cavalry was routinely 3 to 5 times faster, but speed was merely the beginning. These horses provided something far more critical: sustenance. The Mongols transformed their horses into mobile food factories. Mare's milk formed the bedrock of this system. An adult mare yields between 18 and 29 pints of milk daily, considerably more than a cow. In a society where most horses were female, this meant each 5-horse string per warrior produced nearly 15 gallons of milk every day. Now, here's the catch. Mongols, like most Central Asians, were lactose intolerant. They couldn't consume fresh milk without digestive distress, so they fermented it. The process was straightforward. Pour mare's milk into a large leather pouch, typically fashioned from horsehide. Hang the pouch inside your yurt. Each person entering the yurt would agitate the pouch several times with a wooden paddle. The continuous churning, combined with natural bacteria, fermented the milk over 2 to 3 days. Lactose would break down. The resulting beverage, known as Cumis in some sources, was a lightly carbonated, mildly alcoholic drink that served as the steppe's staple. Airag usually contained 1 to 3% alcohol, roughly equivalent to a weak beer. Through various distillation processes, it could be concentrated to 6% or higher, yielding what the Mongols called black Cumis. Even at lower concentrations, the alcohol content was significant when consumed in the vast quantities the Mongols imbibed, and they drank prodigiously. Historical accounts consistently portray Mongol drinking as excessive. One observer noted that when the great Khan began to drink, a musician would strike an instrument, a servant would cry, "Ha!" and everyone would drink together, applauding and dancing. Drunkenness, according to numerous sources, was considered honorable among the Mongols. They typically drank to oblivion, especially during celebrations. Why was this important for military logistics? Because Airag was incredibly caloric and nutritious. A warrior could sustain themselves on Airag alone for extended periods. The fermentation process preserved the milk, made it portable, and transformed it into something that wouldn't spoil for weeks. Each Mongol warrior carried leather bottles of Airag, supplemented with a small amount of dried food. This sufficed. But then there was another source, one that truly appalled civilized observers: equine blood. I want to emphasize that this was not a daily routine or common practice, yet it was a real, effective solution to a problem that would have completely crippled any other army. When Mongol forces embarked on rapid, strenuous marches, pushing beyond normal endurance through difficult terrains unsuitable even for hunting, they possessed an immediate food source literally beneath them. A warrior would select one of his horses, typically one not ridden that day, and make a small incision in a vein. This cut was shallow, just enough to draw blood. He would then consume a few sips, perhaps half a pint, occasionally mixing it with water or Airag to make it more palatable. Following this, he would seal the wound using herbs carried for this purpose, or simply apply pressure until the bleeding ceased. The horse would lose roughly a pint of blood, which it could easily replenish throughout the day. The injured horse would then be rested until fully recovered. Crucially, the warrior gained calories, iron, and protein without slowing the army's advance. Kyriakos Ganzaketsi, a 10th century Armenian historian captured by the Mongols and serving as a secretary, documented this practice. He claimed that a single healthy Mongol horse, using this blood-taking method, could supply daily meat portions for 100 people over an extended period. While this figure seems exaggerated, another contemporary account, stating that a warrior could subsist for 10 days on horse blood without hot food, appears more credible. Comprehending the strategic significance of this was vital. A European army, upon depleting its provisions, faced a critical juncture. It would be forced to halt, resupply, or retreat. Conversely, the Mongol army, encountering food shortages, would only slightly reduce its pace. Warriors would begin drawing blood from spare horses, intensify hunting efforts, and gather wild onions, garlic, and other edible plants. They maintained their forward momentum, only consuming horse meat, known as canina, on rare occasions, such as festivals, special events, or when a horse died naturally. This meat was considered a supreme delicacy. Mutton was commonplace, beef an acceptable alternative, but horse meat was regarded as the highest culinary treat. A single horse yielded approximately 108 kilograms of meat. Historical records of Mongol feasts indicate that to provision gatherings, people would slaughter up to 90 horses, providing about 9,000 kilograms of meat for 7,000 individuals. However, in daily life, horses were seldom killed for meat as they were far too valuable. They simultaneously served as transportation, a source of milk and blood, and as breeding stock. Their logistical system was never destroyed unless absolutely necessary. Instead, this system liberated them from all the constraints faced by other armies worldwide. The Mongols moved with unprecedented speed, operating in inaccessible areas, appearing where least expected, and executing campaigns of incredible duration. All of this was sustained by grass, mare's milk, and infrequent portions of blood from their robust, continuously rotated, small, hardy horses, which European knights might have deemed unsuitable for serious combat. The Mongols grasped something their adversaries could not understand. The best weapon system isn't always the most powerful or complex. The best is the one that functions efficiently under actual combat conditions. These small, resilient horses were perfect. I don't wish to imply that Mongol warriors carried no provisions at all. They didn't ride bareback, subsisting solely on milk and blood. They had supplies, but these were provisions suited for a highly mobile army. Each warrior carried a waterproof leather bag, carefully sealed and treated to repel moisture. Inside this bag was his emergency ration, roughly 4.5 kilograms of dried milk curd, called kurat. Kurat was prepared by drying milk curd in the sun and wind until it hardened. It could be stored for months, even years. When needed, a piece would be broken off, dissolved in water, and after a few minutes, it transformed into something resembling liquid yogurt. It wasn't gourmet cuisine, but kurut was portable, non-perishable, and highly caloric. 4.5 kilograms of kurut could sustain a warrior for several weeks if necessary. Alongside the dried curd, warriors also carried dried meat, which the Mongols called susum. This was made by slicing meat into thin strips and drying it in the sun and wind, sometimes with salt if available, but more often without. The harsh, dry steppe climate naturally preserved the meat into jerky. It was tough, chewy, and lasted indefinitely. A famous anecdote recounts Mongol warriors keeping strips of meat under their saddles while riding. The continuous pressure and warmth from the horse's body would gradually tenderize the meat, making it edible. The genesis of steak tartare, attributed to the Tatars, an ethnic group often confused with the Mongols, is said to stem from this very practice. However, modern historians cast doubt on the accuracy of this traditional account. It appears that Mongols occasionally placed meat on their horses for medicinal purposes, believing certain animal parts held healing properties, rather than as a method of food preparation. We do know for certain that warriors carried dried meat, which they could consume as is or boil with any available wild vegetables to create a stew. Another type of cured meat, known as boars, was specifically prepared for such scenarios. When combined with wild onion and garlic, both highly valued by the Mongols, a quite palatable meal could be fashioned. Furthermore, they always had Cumis, fermented mare's milk, stored in leather pouches. This provided both sustenance and boosted morale. A warrior could spend days in the saddle, equipped only with dried cheese, jerky, and Cumis. The total weight of these provisions was minimal, perhaps around 9 kilograms, including water. Contrast this with a European soldier who might carry 22 to 36 kilograms of gear and rely on supply wagons. However, the Mongols weren't limited to just prepackaged rations. They continuously replenished their supplies through hunting and foraging. This is where their nomadic upbringing proved immensely beneficial. Every Mongol was a hunter from childhood. They hunted on horseback with bows, acquiring food, finding recreation, and honing their combat skills, as these activities demanded similar aptitudes. Their prey included wolves, deer, foxes, and marmots, which they referred to as pharaoh rats. According to Marco Polo, they also hunted birds. In dire circumstances, they could hunt and consume dogs. Hunting was such an ingrained and constant part of Mongol life that Genghis Khan eventually had to issue decrees restricting it during campaigns. His warriors would exhaust their horses chasing game, despite needing to conserve the animal's energy for military operations. This highlights how natural and instinctive hunting was for these individuals. Beyond hunting, they actively engaged in foraging. Wild garlic and onions were particularly prized. Their locations were remembered and marked. Wild pears, chokecherries, mushrooms, berries, and various roots and tubers were also consumed. Mongol children learned to distinguish edible plants from a young age. This knowledge stayed with them when they became warriors. It's also important to note that Mongol armies frequently brought sheep on campaigns. Not enormous herds, but enough so that each unit of 10 men, an arban, had consistent access to milk and occasional meat. The sheep moved with the army, grazing alongside the horses, providing a renewable food source. Putting all this together, we discern a sophisticated system. Warriors carried a 3 to 4 week supply of emergency rations in a 20-pound bag. This was supplemented by Airag from their mares, hunting, foraging, and the sheep accompanying the army. During rapid movements, when speed was paramount, they could even drink their horses' blood. The outcome was an army capable of operating for 120 days or more without external supply chains, a full 4 months. European armies would deplete their provisions in 2 to 3 weeks and be forced to halt for resupply. 4 months of continuous operations without supply lines. 4 months of appearing where there was ample grass, moving faster than messages, striking before defenders could rally. 4 months of warfare that seemed impossible to all who witnessed it. All of this was founded on the effortless movement of life sustained by the land, and an understanding that mobility and endurance outweighed comfort. The Mongols ate simply. They ate sparingly by the standards of sedentary civilizations, yet they fed themselves continuously from a dozen diverse sources, none of which necessitated slowing down or creating vulnerable supply convoys that could be attacked by enemies. In a world where every other army was shackled by its logistics, the Mongols devised a way to break that chain. If you are starting to grasp why this was revolutionary, why it transformed warfare in a manner that European and Chinese commanders couldn't withstand, then hit the like button now, because we are about to delve into how the Mongols organized this system on an immense scale. And this is where it becomes truly impressive. Having a system that functions for 100 warriors is one thing. Making that system operate for 100,000 warriors across an entire continent is quite another. The Mongols tackled this challenge with an organizational structure that was both straightforward and intricate. It all began with the decimal system. 10 warriors formed an arban. 10 arbans created a joghun of 100 men. 10 joghuns constituted a minghan of 1,000. 10 minghans formed a tumen of 10,000 individuals. The foundation of their system rested on units of 10, which simplified calculations and established a clear chain of command. What truly made this approach effective for logistics, however, was the self-sufficiency of each unit. A 10-person arban would possess its own tent, provisions, and livestock. They would hunt, forage for food, and establish camp together. If an arban needed to detach itself from the main force and operate independently for several weeks, it had the capacity to do so, possessing everything requisite for survival. Scaling up, a jagan of 100 soldiers could disengage for autonomous missions. A ningen, comprising 1,000 individuals, functioned as a complete military formation, including officers, scouts, and logistical personnel. And a tumen, with its 10,000 members, was essentially a minor army in its own right. This modular framework enabled the Mongol military to avoid moving as a single, unwieldy mass. They could disperse based on the availability of forage and water, with each individual unit securing its own grazing lands, wild game, and supplies. Subsequently, they would reconverge for battles, orchestrating the convergence of multiple columns over hundreds of miles. To grasp the complexity of such coordination, consider the events of 1241. That year, the Mongols launched invasions into Hungary and Poland. Batu Khan led the primary force into Hungary from the east, while a separate Mongol army under Khaden struck Poland from the north. A third contingent, commanded by Ordu, advanced into Transylvania from the south. All three columns reportedly traversed diverse terrain, followed distinct routes, and engaged various adversaries, but reached their objectives almost concurrently, aligning with a strategy formulated months in advance. The Hungarians and Poles, observing isolated Mongol detachments, mistakenly assumed these were unrelated raiding parties. This was not the case. They were confronting a meticulously coordinated campaign, spanning a front exceeding 1,000 miles. Remarkably, this transpired while other Mongol forces simultaneously conducted operations in Korea, on the opposite side of Asia. One empire, a unified military system, operating on a scale that defied the contemporary understanding of command and control. How did they achieve such a level of synchronization? Primarily through meticulous planning. Mongol campaigns commenced long before the army marched. They began with years of intelligence gathering. Prior to each major invasion, the Mongols dispatched not merely a few spies for a few months, but organized reconnaissance operations that lasted for years. Before the European invasion, Mongol agents spent decades mapping roads, identifying river crossings, locating pastures, and assessing the military strength of each kingdom. They interviewed merchants traveling to these regions and interrogated captured soldiers. This comprehensive intelligence gathering allowed them to construct a detailed picture of the terrain and the enemy, often more complete than what most European kingdoms knew about their own territories. When Batu invaded Hungary, he knew precisely where the grass would be. His agents had spent years verifying the conditions of the grazing lands. This is where the brilliance of their system shone through. The Mongols didn't conquer first and then figure out how to supply their army. Instead, they first determined how to supply the army and then proceeded to conquer. In his chronicle, Hungarian master Roger, an eyewitness to the 1241 invasion, described how the Mongols initially approached the Carpathian Mountains, a natural barrier protecting Hungary, but then retreated a distance of 4 to 5 days' travel. Roger explicitly notes that they left the Hungarian border regions untouched, so that, upon their return, the grass would be fresh and abundant. This exemplifies their planning, a profound understanding of logistics that led them to intentionally preserve grazing grounds for a campaign still weeks away. Another integral part of their coordination was the yam system. This was a network of postal stations, strategically placed at regular intervals throughout Mongol-controlled territories. Each station was equipped with fresh horses, provisions, and couriers. A message could travel from Mongolia to Eastern Europe in a matter of weeks, far faster than any other communication system in the medieval world. The yam system meant that even though Mongol armies were dispersed over hundreds of miles, operating independently, they could still receive orders, send reports, and coordinate actions. It was the communicative backbone that held the decentralized empire together. Critically, however, Mongol armies were not dependent on the yam for sustenance. This was a key distinction. European armies required open supply lines, or they would starve. Mongol armies utilized the yam for information and coordination. For provisions, they relied on forage for their horses and hunting. If the yam system was disrupted, Mongol armies could still function. They would simply operate without centralized coordination. However, even this was largely surmountable due to the thorough training of Mongol commanders. From their earliest days, Mongol warriors were taught to interpret terrain, understand meteorological patterns, and locate water sources and pastures. This wasn't specialized knowledge reserved for officers. Every Mongol learned it, as survival in the steppe necessitated such skills. When a 1,000-man unit detached from the main force, its commander didn't need a manual, a quartermaster, or a weather forecast. He instinctively understood the land. He knew where to find grass, its abundance, and how long it would sustain their animals. He knew how to regulate their pace to prevent exhausting the horses. All this knowledge was ingrained in him because he grew up in a culture where such understanding was fundamental. Scale this up to an army of 100,000 warriors, and you have a force where every unit can operate autonomously. Each commander intrinsically grasped logistics, allowing the entire army to split and reconverge based on the demands of the environment and resources, rather than being constrained by roads and supply depots. Contrast this with European armies, whose supply systems were centralized, vulnerable, and sluggish. Sever a European army's supply line, and you cripple its entire operational capacity. Disrupt a Mongol army's communications, and you merely inconvenience them. Mongols could cover 60 to 100 miles daily, while European armies managed 10 to 20 miles on a good day. Mongols could fragment into 5 distinct columns, each moving independently. European armies had to remain concentrated around their baggage train. Mongols could appear in locations previously deemed unassailable, arrive weeks ahead of schedule, and attack from unexpected directions. And the root of this capability lay in grass. The imperative to disperse in search of grazing land formed the bedrock of their tactical strategy. Their modular organizational structure facilitated effective dispersal. Childhood training ensured every warrior understood and could apply this system. The yam system, in turn, unified all these elements without fostering dependency. It was a brilliant solution, its sophistication entirely beyond the comprehension of contemporary observers who couldn't reconcile it with their notions of advanced logistics. To an outsider, it seemed chaotic, even primitive. But this was a misperception. The system was perfectly adapted for mobile warfare across history's largest empire. Let me illustrate how this system operated using an incident from the Battle of the Kalka River. In 1223, General Subadai commanded 20,000 Mongols. Genghis Khan had tasked him with scouting west of Mongol-controlled territories, exploring lands beyond the Caspian Sea, and gathering intelligence for future conquests. Subadai, with his 20,000 warriors, embarked on a reconnaissance mission that spanned several years and thousands of miles. By 1223, Subadai was in the Russian steppes. Russian princes had been receiving reports of Mongol raids for months. Unfamiliar horsemen would emerge, launch attacks on border towns, and vanish back into the steppe. The Russians sought counsel from the Cumans, a Turkic nomadic people with prior experience encountering the Mongols. Together, they amassed 80,000 warriors, outnumbering the Mongol force by 4-1. The coalition was confident of victory. They held a significant numerical advantage. They fought on their home territory, providing a strategic edge. Established supply lines connected them to Russian cities, and they confronted an adversary who, by all tenets of military science, should have exhausted his provisions weeks earlier. The coalition forces advanced. Subaday's Mongols retreated. For over a week, the Mongols systematically withdrew, staying just ahead of the pursuing coalition. To the Russian commanders, this looked precisely as they expected. Barbarian raiders, inferior in number and strength, fleeing to avert annihilation. But as the pursuit continued, the coalition began to stumble upon curious things. Small groups of Mongol herders with their animals, seemingly abandoned in a hurried retreat, left behind provisions, isolated detachments of warriors appearing disorganized. The coalition forces stretched out as they pressed forward. Different princes commanded different contingents. All followed the Mongols deeper into the steppe. What the Russians failed to notice was that the Mongols were changing fresh horses every few hours. They subsisted on Cumis and dried foods. They hunted on the move. Each night, they set up camp, allowed their horses to graze, and enjoyed full rest. Every day, they covered another 50 to 60 miles. Meanwhile, the coalition troops found their supply wagons. As their faster units forged forward and the slower ones lagged behind, the coalition forces stretched for miles across the steppe. Subutai expertly lured them into a perfect trap for their annihilation. When they reached the Kalka River, the Mongols ceased their retreat. They turned and engaged in battle. The Rus troops were now severely dispersed, broken into numerous columns that couldn't offer mutual support. The vanguards of the coalition encountered the Mongol forces, believing they had finally cornered the raiding party. But then the snare snapped shut. The retreating Mongols were merely bait. Other Mongol detachments, which had advanced parallel to the coalition's movement but were concealed by the terrain, struck from the flanks. The coalition units found themselves under attack from multiple directions by an opponent that should have been exhausted and demoralized, yet was instead fresh and acting in concert. The battle concluded in a single day. By sundown, the Rus-Polovtsian coalition was utterly defeated. An army of 80,000 was crushed by 20,000. Any princes who survived were captured. Subutai reportedly ordered them placed beneath planks and slowly suffocated as the Mongols celebrated their victory feast by standing or sitting atop these boards. The Mongols carried no supply trains to guard. They transported no siege equipment or heavy loads to impede their progress. They sustained themselves by foraging from the land as they advanced. They leveraged their superior mobility to dictate the tempo of the campaign, drawing their adversaries into terrain advantageous for Mongol tactics. And when they finally chose to fight, they did so on their own terms, against a fatigued and divided foe. This exemplified the Mongol system in action, precisely as intended. It proved equally successful in Rus, China, Persia, and Central Asia. While specifics and commanders varied, the core method endured. Move swiftly, travel light, employ mobility to compensate for numerical disadvantage, and let the enemy exhaust themselves trying to keep pace. When engaging in combat, do so on your chosen grounds, utilizing forces positioned by you. News of the catastrophe at the Kalka River eventually reached European courts. The reports seemed unbelievable. How could 20,000 men overcome 80,000? The explanations offered by contemporaries were bizarre. Some claimed demons fought alongside the Mongols, others that they wielded magic. A third group insisted they must have had unrecorded secret reinforcements. The true explanation was simpler and far more terrifying. The Mongols had resolved the challenge of military logistics in a way no one else had conceived possible. They had forged an army capable of operating for months without a supply line, moving with almost supernatural speed, and coordinating actions across distances that should have hindered communication. And they were just beginning. The 20,000 warriors who decimated the coalition at the Kalka River were merely a scouting detachment. The main Mongol army remained in Mongolia and China, preparing for conquests that would eventually encompass a ninth of the Earth's landmass. An empire powered by grass was just starting to demonstrate its capabilities. However, the Mongol system was not magic, and it possessed genuine limitations. To understand these, we must consider Hungary in 1242. The Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1241 stands as one of the empire's greatest campaigns. Batu led approximately 130,000 soldiers in a massive operation that shattered Hungarian and Polish resistance. By the winter of 1241, the Mongols controlled most of Hungary. The capital was theirs, and organized army resistance was suppressed. Hungary, by all accounts, was conquered. Then, in the spring of 1242, the Mongols abandoned Hungary and retreated into the Russian steppes. Historians have debated why for centuries. The traditional explanation was that Ögedei Khan, the great Khan who ruled the Mongol Empire, died in late 1241, requiring Batu to return due to a succession crisis. This is only part of the reason. Recent research, analyzing dendrochronology data and contemporary climate records, has uncovered something else. The weather had changed. From 1238 to 1241, Hungary experienced unusually warm and dry summers. This meant abundant grass. Mongol horses grazed with ease. The enormous herds accompanying the army found ample forage. The entire logistical system functioned without hindrance. Then, 1242 brought cold, wet conditions. The winter was harsh, and when spring arrived, the thaw transformed the Hungarian plain into a quagmire. Pastures were flooded. Areas previously used for grazing were now soggy, muddy tracks where horses struggled to find sustenance. Contemporary reports note that by late spring, 1242, the Mongols ceased feeding prisoners anything but meager scraps. A Hungarian observer reported that hunger was spreading even among the Mongol troops. Archaeological findings and climate data corroborate this. The environmental conditions that facilitated the Mongol invasion in 1241 dramatically shifted in 1242. This is a crucial observation. Mongol records explicitly state that they did not carry fodder for their horses. Instead, they allowed their horses to forage freely on available pastures. When there wasn't sufficient grass, when their horses couldn't find adequate grazing, their entire system destabilized. The Mongols' mobility decreased, their military effectiveness waned, and the advantage that had made them unstoppable vanished. They retreated, not due to military defeat, but because environmental conditions no longer sustained their operational methods. This reveals a fundamental constraint. The Mongol military system absolutely depended on grasslands. In terrain where grass was plentiful and accessible, they were virtually unconquerable. Conversely, in areas lacking grass, they were crippled. This explains their failures in Vietnam. The Mongols mounted 3 invasions of Vietnam in 1258, 1285, and from 1287 to 1288. All 3 campaigns were unsuccessful, with the third ending catastrophically at the Battle of Bac Dang River, which you may have heard me mention before. Why did they fail? Because Vietnam wasn't a steppe. It was a land of tropical jungles and rice paddies. There were no pastures for their horses. The superiority of the Mongol cavalry vanished. Their mobility advantage disappeared. They were forced to fight as infantry in unfamiliar territory against an enemy employing guerrilla tactics. The Vietnamese implemented a scorched earth policy, burning their crops and vanishing into the jungle. The Mongols captured Hanoi 3 times, each time finding it deserted. This mirrored how the Rus found their cities empty, but in Russia, there was grass beyond the cities. Mongol horses could graze, and the army could sustain itself. In Vietnam, it was jungle. The horses suffered, the warriors suffered, and diseases spread. Heatstroke was a constant threat. The third invasion in 1287 to 1288 involved over 100,000 soldiers, one of the largest Mongol operations ever. Despite these forces, they were still defeated at the Bac Dang River by wooden stakes in a tidal river. Strategically, however, they had already lost, the moment they invaded territory that negated their logistical advantages. The situation with Japan was similar. The Mongols attempted to invade Japan twice, in 1274 and 1281. Both times involved massive fleets carrying Mongol and Chinese troops, and both ended in disaster. The challenge lay in the impossibility of transporting enough horses by sea, and even if they succeeded, where would the horses graze on islands comprising rice paddies and forests? The Mongol cavalry system, which dominated continental warfare, proved unsuitable for maritime invasions. When typhoons destroyed the invading fleets, it almost felt like a relief, as the campaigns were already failing due to logistical constraints. This is important because it demonstrates that the Mongols were not invincible. They were perfectly adapted to steppe warfare. Their system worked brilliantly in the grassy corridor extending from Hungary to Korea, but encountered rigid limitations defined by terrain and climate. The pattern is clear. Where grass was abundant, the Mongols triumphed. Where it was scarce or inaccessible, they faced difficulties or were defeated. The Gobi Desert was an obstacle, as were forests and jungles. Mountains were surmountable if good alpine pastures existed. The ocean was insurmountable. Even their successes had limits. After the Mongols conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, maintaining the empire required adapting to a sedentary lifestyle. Kublai, ruling from Beijing, had to maintain a large hunting preserve with pastures near his capital, specifically to ensure the Mongol elite didn't lose their horsemanship skills. This illustrates how fundamental grass and horses were to Mongol identity. The empire ultimately fragmented, partly because governing settled agricultural societies demanded different skills and systems than conquering the steppes. The logistical advantages that made the Mongols invincible in conquest became irrelevant in administration. None of this diminishes their achievements. It merely shows that their success was predicated on a specific system suited to specific conditions. Understanding these limitations helps us grasp why this system was so effective within those very boundaries. The Mongols forged the largest contiguous land empire in history, not despite their limitations, but because they understood them so well, and built a military system that transformed these constraints into an advantage. Returning to our starting point, imagine you are those Rus commanders in 1223, observing the Mongols and trying to discern how they managed to feed themselves. Alternatively, consider the perceptions of Chinese, Persian, and European observers who viewed these nomadic pastoralists with disdain, labeling them as primitive. Yet, everything these onlookers ridiculed ultimately formed the bedrock of Mongol victory. They derided the Mongols for consuming horse blood, considering it a barbaric practice. However, this custom meant a Mongol unit could sustain itself for up to 10 days in terrain where any other army would face starvation. It enabled them to traverse deserts or barren steppes, areas their adversaries believed impassable. Essentially, they carried a mobile food supply that moved with them, immune to interception or capture. The small stature of Mongol horses was also a target of scorn, dismissed as weak and inferior. European knights rode formidable war horses, imposing creatures that appeared far grander. Nevertheless, these impressive beasts required 9 kilograms of grain daily and couldn't graze on steppe grass. They needed stables in cold weather and were too valuable for extended campaigns. In contrast, Mongol horses thrived on any available grass, enduring temperatures that would fell European counterparts. They could cover 100 to 160 kilometers daily, providing milk and blood, all at virtually no cost. Being small didn't equate to weakness. It meant optimal efficiency. Scoffs were directed at the Mongols for their lack of supply lines and logistical infrastructure, but this very absence eliminated vulnerabilities. European armies could be starved into submission by cutting off their provisions. Mongols, however, could not. They would simply hunt more, gather more, and draw blood from more horses. While they might slow down, they wouldn't stop. Their primitive nomadic lifestyle was also a source of amusement, yet it constituted the most effective military training regimen ever conceived. From the age of 3, every Mongol learned to ride a horse. By 5, they mastered archery. They were trained to interpret terrain, understand weather patterns, and survive in harsh conditions. By 16, a Mongol warrior possessed skills that took European knights decades, if ever, to acquire. This seemingly primitive nomadic existence was, in fact, a sophisticated adaptation to one of Earth's most challenging environments. The Mongols weren't primitive, they were specialized, and their specialization translated directly into military dominance. Mongol culture, food, and customs were mocked. Fermented mare's milk, deemed repulsive by Europeans, was a cornerstone of Mongol logistics. The practice of drinking blood, dismissed as savagery, was a stroke of tactical genius. The humble horses, considered unsuitable for anything important in steppe warfare, outclassed European war horses. The profound irony lies in how the elaborate military logistical systems of the 13th century, China's and Europe's, with their supply depots and organized infrastructure, were overcome by a system that seemed unsophisticated, but was, in reality, far more advanced. Advanced doesn't mean complicated, it means effective. And the Mongol system was devastatingly effective. Let me reiterate the figures to truly convey the magnitude of what transpired. Mongol forces could operate for 120 days without resupply, whereas European armies struggled past 2 or 3 weeks. Mongol cavalry routinely covered 60 to 100 miles a day, compared to the 10 to 20 miles of European armies. Mongol units could split into 5 or more separate columns and reconverge at a specified time and location hundreds of miles away. European armies had to move in a single, concentrated mass. The Mongols conquered an empire spanning 9 million square miles, the largest contiguous land empire in history. They achieved this in approximately 70 years. They confronted every major military power of the known world and defeated almost all of them. And they did it while drinking horse blood and fermented mare's milk, riding short-legged horses across the steppes. Living on a diet Europeans considered fit only for barbarians, the civilized world, with its agriculture, cities, and intricate logistics, was conquered by nomads who seemed to have nothing, yet possessed everything. They had mobility, endurance, adaptation to their surroundings, and a system that worked.
Sometimes experts are mistaken. Sometimes conventional wisdom is profoundly erroneous. Sometimes those deemed primitive are operating at a level of sophistication that the civilized cannot even comprehend. The Mongols proved this. They rode out of the steppe on grass-fed horses, carrying 20 days' worth of supplies, and crushed every empire in their path. They achieved this not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by grasping the true essence of warfare. 5 centuries later, Napoleon would declare that an army marches on its stomach. For the Mongols, it was evident that an army marched on grass, mare's milk, and an unwavering commitment to whatever was necessary to keep moving forward. If this narrative captivates you as much as it does me, if it reshapes your historical perspective, then I urge you to take immediate action.
Subscribe, for I possess a wealth of similar accounts, further illustrations of individuals who thrived by defying conventional wisdom, transforming perceived vulnerabilities into advantages, and understanding their surroundings with unprecedented depth. This tale extends beyond the Mongols. It illuminates how we evaluate potential, limitations, and what defines something as advanced or rudimentary. In the 11th century, military strategists universally concurred on the bedrock principles of logistics. Supply lines, infrastructure, and organized replenishment were indispensable. These weren't mere opinions. They were established facts, corroborated by centuries of military history. Then the Mongols emerged, proving these facts to be flawed, or rather, applicable only within specific contexts. Alter the context, shift the environment, and the facts themselves transform. European logistics perfectly suited European warfare. Armies operated on agricultural lands, besieged castles, and traversed established roads. Chinese logistics adeptly served the defense of a settled empire. Yet neither system could adapt to steppe warfare, where grass replaced roads and mobility superseded infrastructure. The Mongols weren't inherently more intelligent than Europeans or Chinese. They were simply adapted differently. This adaptation, which appeared to be a weakness from an external viewpoint, constituted a devastating advantage in their operational environment. This pattern recurs throughout history. A seemingly basic solution often outperforms a complex one. Not always, not universally, but under the right conditions, simplicity triumphs over complexity. Adaptation outweighs innovation, and comprehending one's environment surpasses imposing predetermined expectations upon it. Consider modern parallels.
Agile small businesses frequently outmaneuver massive corporations.
Guerrilla marketing reaches audiences that ignore traditional advertising. Remote work has proven far more efficient than many previously imagined possible, by eliminating the commuting infrastructure we once deemed essential. The lesson from the 10th century Mongols remains pertinent. Your perceived limitations can be advantages if you truly understand them. Your weaknesses can be strengths in the appropriate context, and widely accepted beliefs can be monumentally incorrect. In 1223, the Russians observed the Mongols and saw only an army devoid of provisions, destined to starve within days. Their military sagacity dictated that the Mongols were irrevocably doomed to fail. The Mongols, however, assessing the identical situation, perceived boundless steppes, thousands of horses, and absolute freedom of movement. Their assumptions diverged entirely, and as history unfolded, these assumptions led to the subjugation of half the known world. What are we overlooking today? What advantages do we disregard because they don't align with our preconceived notions of how the world should operate? Which seemingly primitive approaches will, in actuality, prove more efficacious? I lack definitive answers, but I clearly discern this recurring pattern. It indicates, somewhere, someone is currently being underestimated due to their unconventional methods, the apparent simplicity of their system, or their departure from accepted norms. And much like the Mongols, we will likely remain unaware of the magnitude of what's unfolding until it's too late to intervene. Remember that morning in 1223, when Russian commanders spied 20,000 Mongols on the horizon with no visible supplies. Where is their sustenance, they wondered. The answer was omnipresent. In the grass their horses consumed, in the milk those horses produced, in the blood that could be drunk in dire emergencies, in the game hunted for sustenance, and in the dried rations carried by each warrior. This intricate system was perfected over centuries of nomadic life. The Mongols didn't require food provisions in the manner the Russians understood it. They completely redefined the very concept of military provisioning. Traditional armies either transported supplies or had them delivered from behind. The Mongol army itself was its own supply chain. The horse, serving as transportation, also functioned as a food source. Warriors, while fighting, concurrently engaged in hunting and foraging. The nomadic lifestyle, which appeared exceedingly primitive, proved to be the most effective system of military logistics ever devised. This answers why the Mongol army didn't need conventional food supply as it conquered the world, because it was essential to them in their unique way. They simply acquired it from origins no one else ever considered. Their way of living transformed into their method of warfare. Their apparent weaknesses became their greatest strengths. Their understanding of their surroundings was so profound that they could operate in environments where other armies would simply perish. An empire sustained by grassland, a military nourished by photosynthesis, fermented Cumis, and occasionally a small amount of equine blood. It sounds implausible. It seems like it shouldn't be effective. Yet, this armed force conquered 9 million square miles and altered the trajectory of human history.
So, if you now view military logistics differently, if you reconsider what truly makes a system advanced, or how supposedly primitive groups can outperform seemingly advanced civilizations, do me a favor. Leave comments, share other similar examples you've observed, recount other historical instances where underdogs prevailed by redefining the rules, and point out modern examples that mirror the achievements of the Mongols. And if you desire more narratives about individuals who succeeded by defying conventional wisdom, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because history abounds with such instances. Moments when specialists were tragically mistaken, instances where the barbarians at the gates proved more advanced than the civilization within the walls. The Mongols demonstrated that the world is conquered not by the most intricate logistics, but by the logistics best suited to the conditions of engagement. Thank you for watching.